When St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the use of metaphor, he seems quite critical of it. He follows an Aristotelian line, which considers metaphor to be defective in truth. Metaphor doesn't necessarily say how exactly things are, but they're true only in a very qualified sense. They're true by some kind of comparison to another thing. Now, this may seem puzzling, especially if we know that Thomas Aquinas was also a poet. And he understands that metaphor is the lifeblood of poetry. You can't really have poetic speech without being able to make comparisons which are pleasing to the human intellect. Thomas wasn't just a poet, but I think he was one of the greatest poets of his generation. The Office and Mass of Corpus Christi is full of Eucharistic hymns written by St. Thomas, which are beloved by many Catholics today. The sequence Lauda Sion Salvatorem, which is a long, almost very doctrinaire, but very beautiful poem singing the praises of the Most Holy Eucharist, uses metaphors. So how can St. Thomas hold this Aristotelian and liturgical pole, or Aristotelian and liturgical poles, in tension, and not just in tension, but in harmony? I want to suggest that it is his use of scriptural metaphor that allows him to speak truly of God in a way that escapes the normal defect of truth, which happens in normal metaphors. This is related, I think, to his doctrine of the sacraments. He follows Hugh of St. Victor in saying that the signification of a sacrament is based on its institution, that is, its divine institution by Christ himself. Something similar is happening when we use scriptural metaphors, because these are not just ordinary metaphors given to the creativity of any particular poet or artist, but these are metaphors given by God. The sequence Lauda Sion only uses 8 metaphors, and they're metaphors which are very familiar to us who know and love St. Thomas, and who know and love Scripture. Metaphors like the word, pastor, king. These metaphors, because they come directly from the scriptural testimony, allow St. Thomas to speak truly, even if he's using a figure of speech which normally suffers from a defect of truth. And so in this way, St. Thomas is adapting what the later commentatorial tradition will call analogy of attribution. Now, because the images that St. Thomas uses are of divine institution, his use of metaphors are not in the sense of a proportional analogy which only makes comparisons. Rather, he's using an analogy of attribution because he's saying something true that is given to us in Scripture. And so the point of this brief reflection is not to stick to a strictly Aristotelian line by which we cannot speak of something true if we use metaphors. Rather, it's an attempt to point the way forward to see how even metaphorical speech and poetic speech, even though they use comparisons, can ascend to the level of true predication if they are grounded in the communication given to us by God.